Welcome everybody to this research seminar. I apologize for my voice. I spent some time in Uppsala yesterday, and this is what happens to you if you go there. I'm very happy to have Åsa Wikforss here, Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at Stockholm University since 2008, but I think you came to the department 2003 or something like that?
97 actually.
Yeah, but when did you come back after your PhD?
2003 from 97, but we moved permanently to Stockholm in 2003.
Okay.
So it's 20 years now in Stockholm.
I remember that because I came at the same time and
Yes,
we had the
you
rooms next to each other.
Yes,
Which was a
those
great
were
honor.
the days.
Those were the days. But also a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, and more importantly, a member of the Swedish Academy since 2019, that you've been cleaning up the academy, which is very good. She got her PhD in philosophy at Columbia University in '96 on a dissertation then, Linguistic Freedom, an essay on meaning and rules, supervised by Akil Bilgrami. And you also organized now, you more recently organized the first international conference on knowledge resistance, which you've been working on a lot since this big project you have from RJ, Knowledge Resistance Causes, Consequences and Cures, that is finished last year. So
In December.
in December. This long. And of course, you're known for a lot of your publication in philosophy of language, like Against Content Normativities, together with Katrin Glür. But of course, also for the Swedish audience, you're known for your popular science book about alternative facts, about knowledge and their enemies. You've also written a book about democracy, and also recently a book called Filosofiska klarläggande i en grumlig tid. Translate that.
Philosophical, what do you say? Clarifications
in
a muddy time.
Muddy time sounds good. Anyway, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Very, very happy to be here. Yes, we finished our research program in December on knowledge resistance. I will today talk about some of the stuff we've been doing there, this sort of from the more philosophical aspects of it. But I will also try to explain how it's interactive with the empirical stuff that we've been doing. So I think this is a sentiment we can all agree with right now. Of course, this talk about a knowledge crisis or a truth crisis is not new. It started around 2016, which is why I wrote my first book, Alternative Facts. And we know why it started then. But now, of course, we are seeing the very, very real-life consequences of the enemies of knowledge being rather effective in preventing available knowledge from influencing our lives and our policy making, most importantly. And the consequences for democracy, of course, are astonishing, what's going on now. So there are different ways, different entry points to this question of a knowledge crisis. And today I will pick one that comes through a philosopher, because I am a philosopher, Neil Levy. I think it's a useful entry point because it also illustrates some of the central challenges here for how to study this stuff. He has a book from 21 called Bad Beliefs and Why They Happen to Good People, something like that. And this notion of a bad belief, he says they're on topics that are controversial, but shouldn't be, such as climate change or vaccine safety. And more precisely, they're bad because they go against easily available expert consensus. And that's interesting because often when you talk about knowledge resistance, you talk about resisting easily available expert consensus. So it's useful. So some examples. Burning of fossil fuels does not contribute to global warming. MMR vaccines cause autism. GMOs are not safe. Banning possession of concealed weapons increases crime. Trump won the US presidential election 2020. Russia did not invade Ukraine. Basically all the beliefs that the current administration holds. Now, so these are examples of bad beliefs. They're not necessarily false, right? Because expert consensus could be wrong. But they are very likely false because expert consensus has a huge evidential value. So what's interesting about Levy's approach, which makes it interesting from my point of view, is that his sort of astonishing hypothesis is that all of these are rational. Bad beliefs are rational. They've been formed and produced by genuinely and wholly rational processes, where the subject responds properly to the evidence. And that's kind of counterintuitive, and that makes it interesting to dig into it.
Say more what he means with rational, I guess.
I will say a lot more. Don't jump on me, Gustav. And basic his idea, his starting point is this point that people do in the social epistemology special a lot, the sort of dependency on our epistemic environment. That's the central starting point for him. That we're deeply dependent on others, and things can go awry there in ways that makes us not irrational in the end. And the central concept here is, of course, this notion of an echo chamber, which, not to be confused with filter bubbles. Filter bubbles are one-sided information bubbles. And they can easily be popped. You just need to introduce some other information. But an echo chamber is this sort of self-reinforcing networks of trust and distrust, where it's quite possible you hear quite a lot from the out-group, but you have a different level of trust into the in-group than the out-group. And that's rational, according to Levy. That's the basic idea. That's doing a lot of work here. So it's rational to weigh out-group claims, out-group evidence, less highly than in-group. That's a basic trick. And whether it works is what I want to discuss today. Now, of course, this whole echo chamber thing, it interacts very nicely with the stuff that we've been doing in the research program, where we talk about the new information environment. We conceptualize it as this high-choice information environment. Jesper Strömbäck and his very large media group, they're like 12, 13, 14 people that have been working on this sort of idea. But, and a lot of panels and data on that. Basically, the idea that we went pretty quickly from a low-choice information environment to a high-choice information environment somewhere around 15 years ago, 10, 15, maybe 20. And the observation that the greater choice opportunities there are, the more selective people have to be, and the more selective people have to be, the more important the individual motivations and abilities become. And that is, of course, a very important part in what's going on in the current situation of a politically polarized trust in media and research and so on. That's also what they say. It's affected trust and uses of established media, and of course add to that a lot of false and misleading information in this system. And you get an entirely new information landscape, and I don't think we have quite appreciated how entirely new it is and how deeply it influences our cognition and our democracies. Now, of course, everybody says it's bad with the new, fake news and so on. It goes much deeper than that. I think Levy's sort of discussion illustrates that quite nicely. And from the point of view of knowledge resistance, it's interesting, right? Because if he's right, there's a lot less knowledge resistance around than we think, because we think these bad beliefs are prime examples of knowledge resistance. And a starting point for our research project was always that it is an open question whether there actually is any knowledge resistance. You can't assume that. So what you have to do, you need not only to specify what kind of rationality is involved, but also need to locate it in the actual phenomena. And one of the sort of philosophical things we've been pushing a lot in the program is that this is a lot harder than people tend to think. And the reason for that is the role of prior beliefs. What beliefs people have. Because that matters to whether their reaction is rational or not. And you might say, and I've heard this said to me when I'm out sometimes, well, who cares? Bad beliefs are really bad, right? Who cares? Well, it kind of matters because the diagnosis matters to the cure. It tends to be when people talk about knowledge resistance, there's a lot of these psychological sort of counter actions which are very, very individual focused on getting people to affirmation of them so they don't feel bad, and then they take in the science more, or making people, giving people clear explanations, and then they are more receptive to science. So there are lots of individual level solutions going on. But if a lot of this is not actual knowledge resistance, then maybe we need to look at very different solutions. And I think that's kind of true, and I think that's a really important point that Levy's work shows. I will argue, however, that it goes too far. So that's his basic. So here's the basic outline. I will talk a little bit about how we conceptualize knowledge resistance in the program. I will then talk a little bit about Levy's view of bad beliefs, why they're all rational. And then I will talk about detection challenges, because there are these, that's the central idea here, that his stuff does illustrate it is really hard to determine whether someone is knowledge resistant or just have been unlucky, as he says. So let me say a few words about how we conceptualize knowledge resistance at first. That's been the sort of one big task for the philosophers, of course, to provide conceptual clarification and calibration. When you have 4 different disciplines, not everyone may mean the same by information or evidence or belief even. So we've been doing a lot of conceptual calibration, but that's the kind of work philosophers do. So when people talk about, in colloquially, people talk about fact resistance, right? It's not the greatest term, because it's not as if the facts are there, whatever. We can't resist those in a way. You know, the bus will kill you, whatever. But we can. What we really can resist is the evidence that comes to us in various ways. So we rather talk about evidence resistance. I will get to that in a second. Another thing about the colloquial way of talking about it is this idea that knowledge resistance or fact resistance is about believing what you want to believe, not what you have good reasons to believe. And I must have put it that way when I give popular talks. But strictly speaking, from a philosophical point of view, it's not great because we can't actually choose what to believe. I mean, there are philosophical reasons for that. Beliefs are not action. But there is also a lot of psychological evidence. You know, I'm sure Gustav would rather think or believe that he's in Paris right now, but he can't make himself believe that. Or maybe Paris, but Öland, you can't make yourself believe you're in Öland. Right? So we don't have that kind of direct control. There's a lot of philosophical work on that. So therefore, this is not a great way of putting it. It's not wrong to say that desires or motivation interferes, but not in this direct way. So that's, and I'll get to that now in a sec. So we have construed knowledge resistance instead as involving a tendency to resist available empirical evidence. And let me just stress that we're talking empirical stuff here, right? We're not talking values, because we don't want to take a stand on whether value judgments are candidates for knowledge, right? Or policy judgments, because they always also depend on values. We're talking factual empirical examples, like the bad beliefs examples, like anthropogenic climate change is real, whatever. That can be investigated by empirical means. That's the starting point. Resisting the evidence then involves not drawing the proper conclusion. Of course, a proper conclusion is not a function just of one piece of evidence. It's the totality of your evidence. And they are weighing things, and evidence can point in different directions and so on. So it's the totality of evidence that counts here. In philosophy, we talk about two, and in this context, it's relevant to talk about 2 basic and central forms of evidence. First is just experiential evidence, things you directly experience, like you feel the table, you see the table, you smell the coffee, and so on. And of course, a lot of our knowledge comes from that kind of very basic experiential evidence. That's how we navigate our everyday lives. That's what we have in common with the animals. But then for human knowledge, there's also another really important evidential source, and this is what philosophers call testimonial evidence. Evidence that you get from other people through sources of various sorts. So when it comes to most of the things that matter in this context, matter to democracy and to politics and so on, it is knowledge that we get through testimonial evidence. So knowledge about climate change. There might be some experiential evidence for ordinary people, like more floods, whatever. But even that is very mediated through testimonial evidence, because you need to have this attribution science telling you whether this particular flood is to be attributed to climate change. You know, it all always interacts with the testimonial evidence when it comes to these things. Now, as philosophers, we like to say something about the evidence. We think of evidence as propositional. Evidence is not the glass, it's the proposition. There is the glass there, because we're interested in beliefs, right? So when it comes to testimonial evidence, we think of the content of the proposition here is some source says that P. I see IPCC, I always do that, says that anthropogenic climate change is real, for example. That's your evidence, and you take that in. Now, of course, whether that provides a good reason for you to believe that P depends on whether the source is reliable. And there are certain cues of reliability, and that's going to play a very important role for Levy's reasoning, these cues of reliability. So we should keep that in mind. Such as competence cues. So if someone says something about climate change, you want to have some reason to think this is an actual expert. Right?
Any clarificatory questions?
Well, how long are they?
No, because I'm the boss. So
Yeah.
It can be very short, but this is from me actually. Where do you put in, like, you can get some kind of evidence from deduction? I realize a person X is inconsistent, therefore.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of inferences going on, right? So in a deduction, you're going to start with some premises that you get from somewhere, and then you make inferences. No, of course, its reasoning is evolved, obviously.
Reasoning involved, but that doesn't end up in the evidence part, because you can generate evidence that way, don't you?
Oh, can you generate evidence from reasoning?
Yeah, because I realize that this person is inconsistent, therefore the person must be wrong. I can't trust that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, why not? We can add that. But these are the basic types. Yeah, of course. No. And this point about testimonial evidence is really central, because for two reasons. One is, of course, testimonial evidence, because you get it from a source, it's all going to depend on your trust, whether you take that in or not. So if you get testimonial evidence from a reliable source, but you don't trust that source, you're not going to get the evidence, not going to get the knowledge. And if you trust the unreliable sources, you're going to end up believing a lot of false things. So trust, therefore, becomes key in all of this. And that's why the sort of Levy stuff, which is all about echo chambers, which is all about networks of trust, becomes so important. And here, of course, the empirical data that show increasingly politically polarized trust when it comes to all sorts of institutions, science, media, but also the court system and so on, public service in Sweden. You can see this, and you all know the empirical data there. US is worse, but still. The other thing that's important here about the testimonial evidence is just that when it comes to standard cases of knowledge resistance, they tend to involve resistance to testimonial evidence, to what some source says. And that again hangs together with the fact that those are the kinds of issues that we tend to care about, like vaccines and so on. But it's also a reflection of the fact, just a psychological fact, it's much harder to resist evidence that comes from your direct senses, like I said before. There's some experiments in the literature where they try to show that knowledge resistance kicks in also when you look at something. You can certainly see how the interpretation of visual data will be affected. But like I've just written a text on denialism in history and the efforts now to deny the January 6th events. It's kind of fascinating. We had 27 million Americans watching this in real time, and yet now tons of people don't believe it really happened or the way it happened. And it's very interesting to use the tools from our research program to try to understand, how is that even possible? How could we get there? Yeah. Right. Now, I said that knowledge resistance involves a tendency to resist available evidence. There's a lot of unpacking to be done there, right? We could spend days on that, but I unpacked a little bit. But the notion of availability here too, of course, is kind of key and tricky, it turns out. So in the basic case, available evidence is evidence that the subject has. And to have the evidence, as we construe it, is to believe E. You have a belief directed towards the proposition, the evidential proposition E. For example, she believes that IPCC says that human carbon emissions cause climate change, but she doesn't change her belief that she had before that wasn't true. So that's a basic case. But what about case? You might say that doesn't capture what we want, not all of the things we want to talk about here. Because what about the case where people just avoid all sources that they suspect will challenge their beliefs? So you never, ever look at the IPCC reports or anything like that. Should we call those knowledge resistant? Well, they are if their knowledge involved knowledge resistance, it's going to be of a different kind, because if you don't take in the evidence, you can't be irrational. I mean, the basic point about knowledge resistance is that there is an irrational reaction to the evidence that you have. But if you don't have the evidence, it won't be irrational, not directly. There could, of course, still be some kind of irrationality going on in the avoidance of the evidence. And a lot of people in the literature want to include this as a kind of knowledge resistance, where you never read the New York Times because you think they might say something nasty about Trump, for example. So there may also be that we should include that. So in that case, we can talk about knowledge resistance in a narrow sense, where the subject has the evidence, she believes that but she doesn't draw the proper conclusion. Or in a wide sense, where she could easily have had the evidence but avoids it. Could easily have had it. It's doing a lot of work there, right? And you're going to get... an example of it is the selective exposure that media scholars study a lot. That's interesting and relevant to this. But you can see how you get detection problems of its own in this case, because how can we separate these failures to take in available evidence where you have like resistance involved and where you just have limitations of time and attention? And there's a lot of limitations of time and attention in this attention economy, right? That's the whole idea. We had, at our last conference in November, we had Jason Reifeler and Brandon Lyon there talking, and they had some recent data. I just need to write to them to see if where they got this from, but that 40% of Americans had never heard that it was false that Trump won the election 2020. They had never been reached by fact-checking. That's an astounding number, if that's correct. I need to check that. But in any case, so we need to separate these things, and that's hard to do. So there's another detection challenge to determine whether someone avoids the New York Times always is actually doing that in a way that can be described as resisting evidence. Rationality. We said we would say something about this. This is how Levy construes rationality, relevant rationality in this case, and it's how most people do who discuss this, and including us. First of all, we're concerned with epistemic rationality, rationality of belief, not practical rationality, rationality of action. Rationality of action is always a function of both belief and desires. Epistemic rationality is not. Now, it's just a function of beliefs. Now, people discuss whether there can be practical reasons for belief. We don't need to determine that. That's an interesting discussion, but we can leave that aside, because even if that's the case, what we're interested in is epistemic rationality, and their desires will never, ever make it. Desire-driven reasoning is not going to be rational. It's subjective in the sense that people talk about. Subjective rationality, it's rational from the subject's point of view, given her prior beliefs. Levy is very clear on this. The reason, he says, is that the only way we have for tracking truth is through subjective rationality. That's how we find things out. But it's also, of course, a very important point. If you're interested in understanding what people are up to, understanding their belief formation, you are interested in subjective rationality, which is typically construed in Bayesian ways. And it's direct rationality as opposed to ecological rationality. So there is this discussion about whether some of our biases aren't actually kind of good to have ecologically, sort of have evolutionary function. Confirmation bias, for example, has been said. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber has to have this evolutionary function, and that might be true. But of course, if you're interested in whether the subject's reasoning is rational at a particular point, then it's direct rationality. It's not that kind of rationality you want. You want to know whether, in that case, the confirmation bias will not end up being rational reasoning. So these are the things that go into that concept. I hope you were happy, Gustav. Then there's a lot of psychological research into the underlying mechanisms, because it's one thing to conceptualize knowledge resistance as this tendency to resist available evidence. Then we also need to know what mechanisms are involved in this that can plausibly be described as resistance mechanisms. Because we're not interested in random irrationality or sudden cognitive failures or someone being too drunk or whatever. We're interested in a systematic irrationality. And then you need to look at these underlying mechanisms. And there's confirmation bias, like I mentioned before. Bias memory retrieval, bias selection of heuristics. I will get to that soon. That can all plausibly be described as motivated, some kind of resistance here. But by far the most important KR explainer is motivated reasoning that psychologists talk about. This, of course, they've been studying for decades, since the 50s, 60s at least, which is a kind of cognition that involves using your reasoning capacities, as it were, in an irrational way to protect beliefs that you desire to hold on to. They're more or less voluntaristic ways of putting that. I think it's important to stress these are unconscious mechanisms for the most part. So it's not, again, as if we choose this. Although it's related to things we choose, like avoiding the New York Times, whatever. So it's complicated. Dan Kahan and his research team is one of those who've really done a lot of work on motivated reasoning recently, related to the stuff that I'm interested in here, knowledge resistance. And he defines it, I think, in a good way. It's the tendency of individuals to unconsciously, that's good, conform assessment of factual information to some goal collateral to assessing its truth. So there's some other goal that drives the reasoning, other than finding out what's true. And these goals can be the psychological sources of these goals can be manifold. It can be, you may resist information about vaccines because you're simply afraid of taking a shot. Or it may be for, you may believe you have the biggest audience ever, which is where it all started, right? Despite the evidence showing that black guy had more 2009, right? Okay. And what Kahan and his team really have investigated, I'm sure a lot of you know about this, and maybe some of you have done your own experiments on this here, is politically motivated reasoning. Where, remember again, the motivated reasoning has a non-truth related goal. And in this case, the goal is identity protection. And the basic idea behind all this research program, you can really describe it that way, is that there are factual claims, empirical claims, that have become symbols of membership in what he calls an identity-defining affinity group. So my gang believes something about vaccines, or about gun control, or climate change, or GMOs. That was one of the things we looked at in our program too. This belief is part of who we are, even though it's a factual belief and not a value. It's kind of funny, but it can end up that way, right? So if researchers come and provide evidence that that belief is wrong, I have a choice. I can look at that. Again, unconscious. I'm describing it too consciously now. But anyhow, my choice then is to react to the evidence in a rational way and change my belief. But then I run the danger of being excluded from the group because I stick out. And Kahan argues that this sort of belonging to groups is so important to us, so we don't do that. And then, therefore, instead, these mechanisms kick in where our evaluation of the evidence that's coming in is not driven by the goal of truth, but by the goal of protecting the belief. So you assess evidence based on its congeniality to the position associated with your political group. He has done lots of, the team have done lots of experiments on this. I will get back to that because that's where these detection problems pop up. But first I want to talk a little about Levy. Kahan's also central idea here is that this explains the polarization, political polarization in factual beliefs. So that this is what's called fact polarization, sometimes belief polarization, that people from opposing ideological, cultural, political groups have opposing factual beliefs, which is kind of bonkers when you think about it, because that they have opposing values we get, but that they have opposing factual beliefs makes little sense. But it's a fact. Here's some data on this from 23. This is believed that increase in Earth's temperature due to pollution from human activities You see the Democrats there and the Independents and the Republicans believe this is true. And it's kind of astounding. And of course it creates an impossible situation for deliberative democracy, where the idea is that we have all this, we take in this evidence, we debate, we find out how things are, and then once we agree on the facts, we disagree on the policy outcomes. That we can do because we have different values. But if we can't even disagree on the facts, how are we gonna handle political disagreement? And we aren't, obviously. So that's, I think, the really scary part about factual disagreement is how it drives intractable political disagreement. Because value disagreements there will always be, but if we also have this, then we have a problem. Okay, so let me get to Levy on bad beliefs. Recall then that the bad beliefs are bad because they go against easily available expert consensus, and in the center cases they are this result of wholly rational processes, according to Levy. Now, of course, there are some easy cases one can imagine where it is wholly rational to hold a bad belief. You may not know that there is consensus, right? That happens. It happens much more than we, academics, understand. I think this is kind of astounding. This is from 2023, where you see that only 20% of Americans have the correct belief about the level of consensus on anthropogenic climate change. They only 20% know it's above 91% consensus on this. How can that be in a democracy where that knowledge is so easily available? Well, you know, the tobacco strategy has been very successful. That's the strategy for science denialism identified by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their famous book on Merchants of Doubt. And the main the main strategy identified there is precisely to counteract the public perception that there is expert consensus. And you do that by, you know, buying up some fake experts, saying, well, you know, we need more data, we don't really know yet, and so on. And then you go to the media and tell them, come on, guys, you need to be neutral. There's disagreement among the experts, so you need to communicate that. You can't just go out and say the experts say this. So they do that, and then you get this sort of false equivalences. That is such a big problem in media. It's getting better. And then there is a widespread perception that indeed there is expert disagreement when there isn't. So that, of course, is one way to for a bad belief to be rational, because if you don't believe there is consensus, then the most important piece of evidence, testimonial piece of evidence, is not there for you. But that's not what Levy wants to do. He wants to say that it's fully rational in cases of known consensus. And that's a bigger challenge, of course. And this is where all the work is done by these echo chambers that I started talking about. He says this looks like bad reasoning that these guys are engaged in only when you only look at first order reasoning, first order evidence. You also need to look at higher order evidence, second order evidence. And second order evidence is not the direct evidence about raising temperatures, whatever. It's evidence about reliability of the source. That's why these echo chambers come in. And this kind of evidence is provided by certain cues. We were talking about cues of reliability before. Cues of, and Levy presses on two types of cues: cues of competence and cues of benevolence. And these cues, very importantly for him, provide reasons for you to believe something. That's how he's going to make this come out rational. And he basically says that these cues for competence and benevolence, they don't quite work the way they should. They're not knowledge conducive the way things are in our current media and polluted landscape. And therefore people end up rationally having bad beliefs. And of course he thinks it's an alternative to Kahan's explanation of factual polarization that I mentioned before. People are politically polarized on the facts, not because they engage in motivated reasoning, in knowledge resistance, but because of this sort of polarization of the echo chambers that make it rational for people on either side to believe opposite things. Yeah? So let's look at the reasoning around these competence cues and benevolence cues, because that's the key part here. A first point about the competence cues. So competence cues are things like track record, education. You look up, an expert's homepage basically to see what they have going for them to determine whether someone is reliable. For example, so one central claim here that he has, which is an empirical claim, is that the cues for expertise don't correlate well with actual expertise anymore. So these cues don't work. Why not? Well, because there are all these things that are poisoning the epistemic landscape. Parallel institutions, that is to say, I can't remember what it's called, but there's some parallel to the IPCC, what is it called? Some fake climate institution that people refer to all the time, but it's just fake experts, it's all propaganda, it's all disinformation. Right? They're fake and predatory journals, we know that. It's going to be an increasing problem with AI, we know that. There are also internal problems, of course, that pop up. We had the replication crisis. Hit social psychology particularly badly. Now things are stepping up, people are stepping up the game, so I think that's been handled, but in any case, there's a publication bias, there's the industry funding, and there are all sorts of internal problems to the research communities. That can make things a little shaky, definitely. The question is whether this suffices to show what Levy needs to show. It's a very strong claim that cues of competence don't correlate with actual competence, right? And I think it's really hard to make that case. Now there are fake experts, and in those cases we go astray, but we can find out. It's not that hard to find out. So you have to, I think, that empirical claim is not borne out. And of course, in the particular case, I mean, for example, when it comes to institutions, when an institution mismanages something, we have Karolinska, people lose trust, and people rationally lose trust. But it's a little hard to go from there to the conclusion that cues for expertise don't generally correlate with actual expertise. I think you can't make that case. And of course, you can really wonder, does it apply in the case of bad beliefs when there is expert consensus? You'd have to say, because I tried to, maybe someone knows here, I tried to find out, but it seems like there are 10,000 plus serious climate researchers in the world that do specifically climate research. I don't know if that's right, but anyhow, let's say there are 10,000 of them. Should we assume that in this case, and 9% of them agree on anthropogenic climate change, that the cues for expertise don't correlate well for all of these? There's something, he has a point that sometimes it's quite rational not to trust certain researchers or certain institutions. But it's really hard to carry that point all the way to the bad belief case, which he needs to do. So let's go to benevolence cues then, because they end up doing all the work for him, therefore, because I think the competence cue stuff is tricky. So benevolence, you might wonder, why care about like benevolent? What does that even mean? It means that someone shares your values, sort of are like you in some fundamental ways. And there's psychological evidence that we do tend to trust people who we think are benevolent in that sense, that they share our values. That's natural. So here, for Levy, benevolence indicates primarily truthfulness. So someone who is benevolent to you will not lie to you, will not deceive you. Fine. That sounds plausible. Your mother will not deceive you. Mothers do deceive their children, actually. So that was maybe not such a good case. But your friends should deceive you. So. But it also indirectly indicates reliability, therefore, of course, because if someone is trustworthy, if they say what they believe, then and they're not totally incompetent, then it will also be an implication of reliability. And here's this central idea: we give more weight to testimony of those we see as benevolent towards us. This bias is rational because those who don't share my values may seek to exploit me. So that's the basic case here. And then he has this theme about the lucky liberals. Conservatives, he says, do not defer to scientists because they fail to pass this test of benevolence, even if they exhibit cues of competence. because they don't share the values. That must be the idea somehow. Liberals are simply epistemically luckier. They defer to a sufficiently large group of experts, whereas the conservatives, it's just luck that we get things right and the conservatives don't, like in that polarized picture that we saw. All right, so there's a lot to be said about this, but I will just express my skepticism here a little bit. I mean, why don't climate scientists pass the test for benevolence, one might wonder. I mean, it's always said that, you know, every scientist is a leftist. Well, do we know that? But also, does that mean that they are not benevolent in an interesting sense in this context? And of course, it can't just be that the climate scientists say that that anthropogenic climate change is real. That can't be the reason you infer they're not benevolent, because then you're bootstrapping in a problematic way. So it's got to be something else. And again, we get back to the point about bad beliefs and consensus. Do people, so you're in an echo chamber in, I don't know, Alabama, or wherever it might be, where all your friends say that climate change is not to worry about, it's not a real thing, and all your news, because you get it from Fox News and things like that, it's all sort of there. But you also know, because remember, the premise is that we have known consensus. You know, all the experts agree that anthropogenic climate change is real. Can you make this, the bad belief, rational in that case? Well, you'd have to think that all these climate scientists are lying. Either your gang is wrong, or they're all liars. Right? And how can you make that come out rational? Well, there are ways. Did you see this movie that came out? Climate, the movie. It was a year ago about. It got like 1 million views on YouTube within a week. We had some serious Swedish opinion leaders who said, oh, finally a movie that sets things straight. I won't mention their names. But this is precisely, you can see the film that lifts the lid on the climate alarm and the dark forces behind the climate consensus. A lot of this propaganda is precisely directed against the belief that there is consensus, that this consensus has evidential value. Because of course, if the reason there is consensus is not that experts have emerged from different directions, because they come from very different directions, on the same conclusions. The reason there is consensus is they got together and agreed to lie about this, because they can make money off of this or something, or they want to introduce socialism or what have you, which is the sort of claims that you get here. Lots of fake experts in this movie too. Now, of course, if you believe such a conspiracy theory, that gives you a reason to downvalue a lot the evidential value, downgrade the value of the expert consensus. Because those guys are just agreeing because they are conspiring, not because they reached the truth. But then, of course, the next question pops up. Is it rational to believe the conspiracy theory? And it's interesting when you look at empirical data on science denialism, the most common factor they have in common, regardless of what science it concerns, if it's climate change or vaccines or GMOs, is a conspiracy theory about the research. That's the number one reason people don't believe what the experts are saying. So the conspiracy theories that are highly available out there in our new high-choice information landscape do a lot of work here to rationalize resisting the scientific evidence. But again, then, okay, so we have the expert consensus, we downgrade the evidential value of that because we have a conspiracy theory. Okay, but is that rational to believe? Now, there's a big discussion in philosophy whether it can ever be rational to believe a conspiracy theory. I think it's not a good idea to define it out of existence. I think it could be rational to believe in a conspiracy theory, although sort of objectively they tend to be, inconsistent and obviously false and all that stuff. So it could be rational, but with these sort of things, it's really hard to make it come out rational. And Levy tries the same thing again. He says, oh well, if you're unlucky, you end up in an echo chamber where everybody believes conspiracy theories, and then you have cues of benevolence and competence, and then you're rational. I think that's really hard to make that case there. Because if you live in an open society, in a democracy, there's going to be a lot of evidence against your conspiracy theory. Okay. Now, I want to talk finally in, I don't know how, I maybe have 10 more minutes, is that okay? Okay. I don't know. No one told me how long to talk. Okay, I'll try. So we talked about these Kahan experiments, and I think that it's familiar to a lot of you, so maybe I don't have to say all that much about it. Basically, the idea is that the information is held constant across conditions, but the relevance of or the implication for the subject's political identities is varied in these experiments. So in one situation, in one condition, you get information that's congruent with your political outlook, and in the other situation, people get information that's non-congruent with their political outlooks. And then you look at how people respond. And the key finding, indeed, is that the evaluation of the information differs depending on whether information is congruent or not with your political outlook. And that, of course, Kahan's team take to be a very good example of politically motivated reasoning. But, as has been pointed out in the literature, people's political identities are often correlated with their prior beliefs, including beliefs about, relevant issue, climate change, or beliefs about who to trust. And prior beliefs, of course, influence how you reason, should influence how you reason, if you're being rational, in absence of political motivation. And this effect confounds the experimental data. This nice paper by Tapin et al. From 2020, where they make this case. And this has been something that we philosophers have been pushing a lot in our program. Psychologists are happy to do their experiments, but they really don't want to worry about this as much. But in our program, the psychologists have been working with us to do some experiments where we try to check for prior beliefs. I'll get to that, hopefully, very briefly at the end. So here's one typical Kahan experiment. People get to see these profiles of fictional book authors. Look at those guys. On the books on risks of climate change, nuclear power generation, laws permitting concealed handguns. And they get to read a book excerpt where the content of the excerpts are varied. Sometimes they're congruent with a liberal sort of position on climate change, whatever. Sometimes the content is compatible with a conservative position. And then you have groups of liberals and conservatives who, randomly get assigned to read either, and then you see what happens. Because the question they asked is this a knowledgeable, credible expert on these topics then? And they get these very so in one condition, liberals see the identity congruent messages, and in the other, it's the conservatives that do. And indeed, they get the results that evaluations differ by condition. Whether you identify someone as an expert depends on whether the message this expert comes with fits with your political outlook. Same as with this. And what makes this particular experiment interesting from a philosophical point of view and from the point of view of this Levy discussion is that it concerns judgments of reliability, which has, here's the graph they get, it's very neat. So the blue one is about an expert communicating that there's very high risk of climate change, it will have terrible consequences. And the red line is where the message is there's very low risk and nothing bad will happen anyhow, type thing. And here you can see how when you have the blue messaging that climate change is a big problem, the very liberal, strong Democrats will strongly agree, and then the very conservative, strong Republican that will agree that this is a guy is an expert, right? Remember, that's the question asked him. Will disagree. And then when you have the opposite message, the liberals will disagree and the conservatives will strongly agree. So it's very neat result for Kahan. But there is a problem here. Right? The hypothesis of Kahan's gang is, of course, that these reliability assessments often are a result of politically motivated reasoning. But this inference goes through only if we assume that what someone says on a topic cannot give us a good reason to think that they are not reliable. And that's false. And philosophers have pointed this out long before. And not in this context, but if your colleagues who you trust a lot suddenly start talking about shape-shifting lizards and stuff, you don't immediately believe what that colleague is saying. You start not trusting your colleague, right? And in this case, if you read about these guys and the excerpt says that this guy says that climate change is not real. And you know there's expert consensus, a very rational conclusion is that this guy is not an expert. That's not motivated reasoning. That's rational. So there is a confound here. Now, of course, it may also be, if we assume that we have a Levy case where the conservatives know there is consensus, then in this case the liberals are actually more rational in their reactions. Well, whereas there seems to be a lot of motivated reasoning going on the conservative side when they deem someone to be not an expert just because that person says that climate change is real. So you can see the confound, right? Okay, I have 2 slides left. Should I do those? We can also take it in discussion if you want. We can. So this is a standard design that Kahan have been using that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. Have you? Yeah. So it's these 2x2s where they have you read a little story. We have the liberals and conservatives again. You read a little story, and the question pops up asked is what? And here then you told we have some data here on this story, and then you asked what conclusion do the data support? So they have these neutral scenarios where about skin cream, but patients who did use the new skin cream, patients who did not use the new skin cream, and rash got better, rash got worse, right? So people are asked, what actually happens? Did this work, the skin cream or not? Did the rash get better? And you have the control here, they didn't use the skin cream. That's a neutral condition. Then you plop in some politically charged conditions, right? Cities, we have a story of cities that wonder whether forbidding the carry of concealed handguns will bring down the violence or decrease crime. So you have some cities that try that and some that don't. It's always the same numbers. And then you get this data. And the trick in these experiments is always they shift these. You can see here it says decrease in crime, there it says increase in crime. It's the same numbers. So you shift it around, and then you can see how people respond to these data, to what extent it's in concordance with their political outlooks when they get the answer correct. And here are the conclusions that they get no differences in conclusion conclusion accuracy, because that's the question: can they get this data correct, right? Between liberals and conservatives in the neutral scenarios, but when the results are congenial with your political outlook, people are much more likely to get to interpret the diagrams correctly. And when it's not. There's also a numerous effect in these experiments that people who are more numerate do worse and tend to be more motivated, according to Kahan. That result, you can tell you, has not replicated very well. Yes, and we have run this. We replicate the influence of politics, but we don't get numerous effects. And that's true for many of these experiments. Did I lie? But I didn't lie. I have one and a half more picture. So there's a really neat, a good question about the Kahan experiments is, where is the politically motivated reasoning in this? What seems to be happening is that sometimes people calculate and sometimes they don't. And there's a neat new paper out by Katrin Glür. I said in the beginning, or at least it said on the slide, that all of this is work I've been doing with Katrin Glür. But this particular paper I've not been involved with. It's by Katrin Glür and Levy Spectre. It's very neat. It just came out. There's actually where they argue there's actually no motivated reasoning here. What there is motivation to calculate, which is very different. Because what happens, what's tricky about these, of course, is that these are difficult numbers. People, when they see these diagrams, tend to go by heuristics that will get them end up in the wrong place. So one heuristic people do is they just look here. Oh, it increased more than, of course, banning carrying concealed handguns in public is the way to go. Or they go just look, much more there than there. That's another heuristic. But you have to actually calculate. You can see here the numbers to get this right. And what Gluer and Spector argue is that what happens in these situations is that when you get this, look at this diagram, and the heuristics tell you that this fits with my politics, then you don't calculate. Then you just stick with the heuristics, and you end up getting the incorrect answer. But when the heuristics don't fit with your politics, you calculate, and you're more likely to get the right answer. And that's the mechanism here. It's not reasoning. It's a very nice little paper, which gets me to a last slide. These are experiments, the data we're just sort of getting now this week, right? So it's very preliminary. But we checked for prior beliefs. So we asked people, we have these topics: gun control, healthcare, immigration, police oversight, and taxation. We can talk more about it. And we get definitely effects, both on political identity. So this shows you how much more likely people are to get the result correct when it's concordant with their political identity than when it's discordant. So you have 8.1% more likely to get it correct there. But we get the same look for prior belief. 9.1% more likely to get correct when it coheres with prior belief. So that's a confound in these experiments too. Sorting out exactly how these interact, we haven't done yet. We'll look at that. But it definitely shows there's a confound in these experiments, and that's a problem. So the experimental data for there being a lot of motivated reasoning is not as clear as we might think. And then we also have this messy business of the information environment around it that Levy talks about. So this is a conclusion. And yeah, here's again. I'll just stop there. That was involved. These are the PIs for the program for the 4 disciplines. And me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Sorry. Wow. Thank you very much for this lovely talk, enlightening talk. I think my motivated belief that it would be a good talk actually was a true belief. Anyway, so welcome to the question and answer period. As usual, we have an audience online, and you use the chat function to ask questions. So if you wish to ask a question, you should write it in the chat, and also write your field, because we like to mix questions from different fields. And here you just put up a hand. And we also like follow-up questions, and then you should write who you follow up to if you write in the chat. And here, well, just put up a finger, and I'll figure it out. So, and given that, I guess we have some questions somewhere, and I think, maybe not surprisingly, we're going to start with Joe.
Thanks, Åsa. That was super interesting. I want to ask you a little bit about the part where you were pushing back on the benevolence test. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question is, when you're evaluating like how crazy the belief would have to be for them to reject the consensus, how much are you kind of baking into this condition that they have the evidence that there is an expert consensus? And I guess what I mean by that is, do they have to believe that they are experts, and do they have to believe the other stuff, like the reliability stuff? Because I guess my perception of the US is they just have loads of other reasons to already believe that these people are leftists. Like there's this polling information that university towns are very Democrat voting. They think that they're all into affirmative action. And so there are all these kind of separate lines of evidence that lead people to have the belief that these academics, us, we are super not like them. And then you say, well, it's nevertheless like 97%. You'd have to believe they're all lying. It's a conspiracy. But they might just believe we're doing the motivated reasoning because we have such a strong ideological bent that's so different from theirs, which is kind of like believing that we're not real experts, that we are just driven by, I don't know, identity protective reasoning. So, but I worry that maybe in saying that, it's not giving what you're assuming, which is that they have this evidence.
Well, I mean, absolutely. We can easily imagine a situation where it would be rational, right? I'm not saying that's not possible. You'd have to build a lot of stuff in there. And again, it's an empirical question. I think, and you're quite right to push those kinds of things because, of course, there is a lot of, and this illustrates also how the propaganda interacts with motivated reasoning. Because if you want to resist expert evidence, it's not hard to find like reasons out there, right? Someone recently in The Atlantic had a really nice piece where they wrote that the problem with the new information landscape is not really like fake news and stuff. It's that it functions as a justification machine. It helps you hold on to beliefs you want to hold on to in the face of evidence. And I think all that stuff about the crazy woke left and all that, and academia in general being that way, that goes into that. So we can imagine a guy who has all that stuff. But you also have to imagine other things, living in a democracy. You have to imagine, because they trust other types of science, right? So they have to think, I mean, typically because they fly and they have their mobile phones and
Flick light switches.
Yeah, and all sorts of things like that. So there has to be that somehow this gang and all of them, 10,000 plus, and okay, there's a lot more flooding going on, but no, and there's so much evidence if you live in a democracy. If you don't, I mean, I think there's a really neat paper by what's his name, Bauman, about on a context of total epistemic seclusion in a sect situation. There it may be rational to believe all sorts of really wacky stuff, right? But when you live in a democracy, this is also a point about echo chambers being different from filter bubbles. You have a lot of other information. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but what I am disputing is the claim by Levy that in the standard cases of bad beliefs, it's fine. That I think is going to be very unlikely. This is all kind of empirical speculation, but there are some philosophical points there.
Yeah, you're pointing out it's a very high bar, actually.
It's a high bar, yeah, much higher than he thinks. And he kind of seems to agree with that. He's like, yeah, but someone had to make this case. And I think that's good. Someone should make that case.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question, because I mean, your main argument here, Levy is forgetting that you have to believe a lot of other things to be able to sustain this, like a kind of crazy conspiracy theory and stuff like that. But it's so obvious, so he didn't realize that.
No, he goes for the whole echo chamber picture and talks a lot about these trusts and relationships and how completely distrusting everything that comes from the outgroup is rational.
So he's looking at it more like a sect. That's the
he
problem.
is. I think that's one way to put the criticism. He's looking at it more like a sect, and it's not in a democracy. That's not the situation you're typically in. He says at some point, well, of course, it's not rational to give external testimony zero likelihood, but we never do that. That's very rare. I think he needs to say that we do that in a lot of these cases for it to sort of hang together. I think one of the best examples, of course, is the election denialism. I mean, it's just an astonishing amount of evidence that it was false that Trump won, and that evidence has been widely available. And yet there are, of course, a lot of false claims about manipulated voting machines and so on. But even Fox News, who knew they were lying, had to pay $700 million or something, right? Because of that lie. So it's around, it's available if you want it. Then there's, again, the question about avoiding evidence altogether and only watching Fox News and stuff.
Good. We have a question from the online audience. Anna Tillström.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anna Tillström, and I work here at the IF, and I'm an organization theorist, not a philosopher, so it won't be a philosophy question. I found this super interesting, as I've been doing quite a lot of work on expertise and virality and online. So I have two questions, maybe. One is the role of social media platform organizations in this epistemic chaos. The picture that you're painting, because it seems to me that it would have been impossible without these social media, this fast exponential spread of facts that look real. Like what we found in our research and other sociologists have found it too, is that the most viral expert claims by non-credentialed experts are those that combine traditional expert or expert-looking discourse with very emotional discourse. This is from the COVID. Like that's what we found. People who are doctors, maybe not specialists or researchers in that field, but combine it also with very strong emotional content, and it gets shared much more than the credentialed
Yeah, hopefully she can hear us.
experts who don't tend to use this emotional language. And it's been shown because most people who social legitimate this on X, it's like, because it's so fast, people form their opinions so fast. So I was wondering if you know anything about, like, if there are experiments where people are allowed to have more time, if that makes a difference.
That's a really great question, because I do think speed is really a very big part of what's going on. I'd love to see your data, by the way, and of the emotion-driven component. I mean, that's a very neat idea, by the way, that you have this appearance of expertise, and often in these movies, you have these fake experts. In the Plandemic, that movie, that was another one of those where you had fake experts who are also very emotional. I think that's a very interesting, because that ticks both the boxes of competence and benevolence somehow, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's neat. Speed, what I know about that is that one thing I know, and that's from our program, Torun Lindholm and her team have looked at when you give people, because these 2x2s, they are complicated, right? It's easy to misinterpret those. When you give people information that's harder to misinterpret, it's harder for them to resist it. And that could be related to speed too. If things go very fast, you can, the sort of, there are all sorts of mechanisms that can come in the way of critical thinking and truth tracking capacities, as it were. And we also know from stuff that they've been doing in political science team that when you give better arguments, explicate things more, arguments that seem clear and compelling, you do better. And that's also harder to do when things are fast. So I think there might be some connections with speed there, but I don't know of the literature is vast on this now. I don't know of any experiments that have looked exactly at the role of speed here, but that will be very interesting, of course.
With that, Anna.
Thank you.
Very good. Then we have Olle.
Okay, thank you very much, Åsa. I think this question is similar to Joe's, but maybe from a different angle a bit. I wonder how you think exactly about these higher order beliefs and how they matter for rationality. There was one point when you said that whether testimony gives a good reason to believe that P depends on whether the testifier is reliable. And that sounds a bit maybe too externalist, given your sort of subjective notion of rationality, right? So I don't think that's what you want. Is that correct?
Yes. So that's a big discussion to be had there. Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. So maybe what you do want, or I mean, one possible thought is, well, maybe it depends on whether the sort of hearer believes that the testifier is reliable. But then I think the Levy view starts to seem much more plausible, because surely these people don't believe that the IPC is reliable, right? So
yeah. No, I totally agree with that, and I do agree with Levy's outlook that we need these cues for reliability, and competence cues are key there. I mean, there's in philosophy a big debate about whether you should be you should take the assumption that all testimony is reliable until you have a reason to think the opposite. That some kind of just what's it called again? No, it's not called conservatism.
Non-reductionism, is that what it is?
No, it's called something else. I can't remember now. But anyhow, that's the idea, that it's the basic assumption is just everything is reliable unless you give an evidence against that. So that's one kind of view which I don't share. So it's not what I meant. And one way to make that out, of course, then you can go more externalist and you say, well, as long as they're actually reliable, it doesn't really matter. That's all we need. but I'm not that externalist. So I think, yes, you need these cues of competence and benevolence. And that's why he has a running chance. He has an argument here that we need to discuss, because you're quite right, of course, that they believe that climate scientists are unreliable and so on. But you can also then, of course, ask the question, what reasons do they have to believe that and so on. So then you get into this bigger game that Joe was talking about. And there is a bigger game there, definitely. And again, it shows how it interacts with a poisoned information landscape. We didn't have politically polarized trust before, not like this. I think that's one of the most interesting findings. If you look at trust in science and so on, a few decades ago in the US, Republicans had higher levels of trust in science. It's not as if the academics were less leftist in the 60s or 70s, whatever, right? So
Maybe they have changed voters since then.
That's definitely part of this too. But in any case, there is that interaction. There's plenty of reasons not to trust, provided in the information sphere not to trust climate scientists that you can pick up on. So definitely. But that's a good point. That formulation is a little misleading because it's not actually the view here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're happy with that? Very good. Marie?
Excuse me. Thank you so much. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Marie. I am a PhD student in criminal law. So I'm also from a different field. So my question concerns, it goes way back at the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about knowledge or evidence resistance in the wide versus narrow sense. So my question would be, if I take an example from law and from motives, for example, from the government for legal reform, sometimes it is the case that they are not contesting the evidence or denying the evidence or the reliability of the evidence. For example, whether a certain measure will be effective for reducing crime, yes, what have you. But rather the issue is that they fail, in my opinion, to view it as a relevant reason for the policies. So it would go something like this. I think that the person believes that the expert says some evidence. We can even say that they perhaps suspend judgment regarding the evidence, or even for the argument's sake, that they are actually accepting the evidence or the truth in the evidence, the reliability of the evidence. Rather, it is the case that they don't view the evidence as a relevant reason for the reform. So would you think that that would count as knowledge resistance in the sort of narrow sense, that they are resisting the evidence, not the reliability, but the relevance? Or is it rather that they avoid the source? Or is it not a matter of knowledge or evidence resistance at all?
The last, I would think.
Okay.
So here is how I think about that. So, for example, harsher punishments, right? That we hear a lot about, or putting children in prisons or whatever. Okay, so the experts go out and say, actually, you guys, there's no evidence that harsher punishments decreases crime. And they say, interesting, but that's not actually why we want harsher punishments. Because, people should just suffer when they've done something badly, or at least they're locked up for a long time and so on. So they provide all sorts of reasons for why that empirical evidence is not actually relevant to this policy decision. Problem with that often, I think, is that when they otherwise motivate these very harsh things, and sometimes involving limitations in individual liberties and freedoms, right? They motivate that by saying, it will decrease crime. So I think it's a very fake game that's being played around that. Dishonest, I would say a lot of that discussion is, rather than knowledge resistant.
Erik Agner.
Thank you so much, Åsa. This is terrific. I just want to invite you to say a few more words about the conceptual questions with which you started. So knowledge resistance, the way you defined it, makes it sound like a species of confirmation bias, to the extent that it's a refusal to update in the matter that one should if one were a Bayesian or something. But then the problem of bad beliefs is much broader than that, right? I mean, it isn't just that people refuse to update in light of what the scientists say. It is that they come to believe like wacky, wild things about microchips and vaccines and, the staged moon landings and, all sorts of like crazy stuff. So these people are updating fine, right? Just, in the wrong way and in response to the wrong signal.
They end up believing wacky things, but the way there is a combination of resisting evidence against the wacky things, and that's knowledge resistance, blindly believing other wacky things, and that's being fed to them from information, the Poisson information landscape, and which is typically irrational in the sense that it's they trust sources they have no reason to trust, and so on. So when you end up in a really wacky place, you have a combination of all sorts of things, including knowledge resistance, because there will be evidence against, Earth being flat. It's fascinating to watch that Netflix movie, if you've done it, The Flat Earth. It's fascinating. Because these guys, they do experiments. Because they want to test their hypothesis that the Earth is flat. And they have some really expensive equipment they use to they have measuring equipment and light things that they use. And each time, of course, the experiment doesn't support that the Earth is flat. And they go, oh my God, there's something wrong with this equipment. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on all the time. But you don't end up in a totally wacky place unless you also take in a lot of other wacky stuff. And that may or may not be taken in a rational way, depending on what echo chamber you belong to. It's when you have train crashes like that, it's not one factor, it's all sorts of things. Confirmation bias, though, is just, it's an open question. When you do the conceptual work, it's an empirical question what the psychological mechanisms are. Confirmation bias is one of them, maybe. Motivated reasoning is certainly one of them, where you can plausibly say that this kind of reaction to the evidence is not just, I'm temporarily confused or stupid or whatever. It's I'm actively resisting the evidence. And then some psychological mechanisms are candidates for that, and confirmation bias might well be. But that's an open question.
Let's see. Then we have online Joachim Philipson. If you put on your mic.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting talk. I work at the Stockholm University Library as part of the research data management team. So my question is, which you already touched upon, if you can, the possibility of increasing reliability of testimonial evidence by asking for at least 2 independent sources of the same evidence. I mean, this is a requirement already for exacting some punishment in the Bible and Talmud and in judicial court processes. And it's, more or less a routine in professional journalism. Of course, the key question is here what independent mean, because it should not allow then for conspiracy theories lumping together all expert evidence as part of the same biased clique in some sense. So would you think it possible to combat conspiracy theories by showing how different witnesses or testimonials came to their conclusions independently from one another, or is that too complicated? Thank you.
Well, it's certainly a good piece of advice that journalists have done a lot, and that now in the schools, hopefully they teach the kids, and not just to think vertically, but to think horizontally, to take in different sources when you're not sure about something. So that's absolutely right. It doesn't help all that much, maybe if you're in an echo chamber, depending on what what sources you have access to. But about counteracting conspiracy theories, I don't know if you guys have followed this. There was a research paper before Christmas, and now there was a follow-up one where they used AI chatbots to interact with people who believed in conspiracy theories. And they have some interesting results, and which kind of chimes with what we are after, which is that what happens in this case, because it's AI, you can target it to the individual person's particular reasons for believing in a conspiracy theory. So if you have the 9/11 conspiracy theory, for example, well, that wasn't actual conspiracy, of course, but the other conspiracy theory about that it was the American government who did it, and they had put bombs in there that detonated, because there's no way this thing could fall that quickly otherwise. So that's the reason a lot of people think that something else was going on. Actually, scientists have shown this is precisely how quickly it would fall if it gets impacted by a plane at that speed and so on. So when this guy in this chatting situation says, well, the reason I believe in that conspiracy theory is because there's no way these buildings would have fallen like that fast in that fashion. Then the AI says, well, actually, there are studies showing that this is precisely, and here's an image, a video of how they have simulated this and blah, blah, blah. That works. And I think that's really interesting, because that speaks to our basic rationality. I mean, I didn't say that so much here, but I do think we are basically very rational. We have a hard time resisting evidence and not updating in a rational way. We sometimes manage to, because the psychological mechanisms interfere. But if you want to help people get out of crazy beliefs, the way to do it, I do believe, is through rational means. And this is a really cool example of that. They just had a follow-up study now where they tried to determine exactly why this works, which I haven't read, but I certainly will, because I thought this was very, very intriguing. Not something you can scale up, perhaps, but it speaks, I think, to a question, that fundamental question: should we, when we encounter people that have wacky beliefs, as it were, should we assume they are rational and engage with them in rational ways? And I think the answer is yes. Now, of course, there are emotions involved too. If you're being like an asshole and arrogant and saying to people that they're stupid, that's not going to help. But I do think we should engage with them on a level of reasons. But it's very hard to scale up. We can do it in our private lives, but it's really hard to do on a societal level. Maybe AI can help us.
Happy with that? Very good. Then we move on, and next is Stina. The microphone should be somewhere. Yeah, thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. Thanks for this, Åsa. It was very interesting. I had a question. There was at some point, at least, you characterized bad beliefs as resistance to easily available evidence. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more about how we should think about easily accessible in this case. So if I can just start by elaborating how I'm thinking about it, or how the problem's going to occur, is that I would think that in many of these cases, sure, there's kind of relatively easily accessible to see the evidence that speaks to the truth. But it's even more accessible for, in many cases, the counter evidence or evidence to the contrary, especially because of like algorithms and things like that. So in those cases, it would be the difficulty, right, is that there's just a lot of evidence that is easily available for an individual, and the fact that like one or some of those pieces of evidence are reliable might not help very much, because there's so much other things going on, and then I would think that it becomes a lot more demanding, because an individual would need to also go into detail about all these pieces of evidence and look into kind of research papers, and not just see the research papers, but also go into who is this, where are they affiliated, is this a reliable source, and suddenly it just doesn't look very easy anymore. So yeah, I wonder if you could say something more about how you're thinking of this.
Yeah, I mean, totally. This is a good description of the challenges, right? No, so the bad beliefs is what Levy defines is that goes against easily available expert consensus. But then I was talking about knowledge resistance as involving resistance to easily available evidence. And then I distinguished two cases: one where you have the evidence, so you believe that, you know, IPCC says something. But the other case, I said, is challenging, where you say, well, you don't have the evidence, you just kind of avoid it. How can we, and we might want to call that knowledge resistant too, because if there is some kind of motivated avoidance of certain sources, it seems very, very plausible to call it knowledge resistance. But like I said, it's really hard to distinguish motivated avoidance from just the general mess out there, where partly it's attention issues, and a lot of this sort of flooding the zone with shit, that's an attention point, right? Just overwhelm people so that they will miss what's true and relevant, and then will just drown in the rest. And it works really well because we have limited attention capacities. So that's one thing. And then even if, you know, someone is in a situation where, and like you said, also the algorithms that play a very important role here, of course. You could see how they interacted, especially with confirmation bias, in really nasty ways, because we all like to get information that confirms our beliefs. That's how we are, and the algorithms are so happy to help, right? And this is how you do end up in this kind of tunnel situations. Right now, I'm being fed so much about how badly things are going for Trump that it's ridiculous, and I realize I should try to look beyond that because it's too optimistic. Yeah. So, and in addition, it's hard work, right? Like you're saying, okay, so maybe, you know, well-intentioned people, they get fed a lot of shit because that's where they happen to be, but they want to get other information, but they don't really know where to go and what to trust. And that's part of this high information landscape. That's so much of the work, the responsibility fall on us as individuals. And it's the task that we're not very well equipped to handle, simply. Because it's difficult and it's time consuming and all that. In the old days when we were like fed news in this sort of, the evening news, Walter Cronkite, everybody watched that. And that was easy. Now we have a difficult task, and it's a task that we don't manage very well. So definitely that's a big part of this.
Thanks.
Very good. Then we have Kirsti.
Thank you. Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Yes, thank you very much for this talk. It was very interesting and also very relevant for me because I'm Kirsti Julham. I do research about climate change denial, and I have also interest in terminology of skepticism and also interest in rationality part of all of this. And I kind of like, I'm still not kind of like, I don't really know whether or not rationality here is, if we can say that people are rational or the beliefs are rational or not. So maybe I first have a proposition and then I open up a bit about it. Could we maybe get around some of this kind of like dispute by saying that people are rational, but the beliefs might be still irrational?
But the what?
But the beliefs might be irrational. And so here I kind of like refer to my own conceptual discussion about denial versus skepticism, where I think that in some cases we have to be able to say that some belief is denial. For example, does not believe in climate change. This is denial because best available evidence says that climate is changing, and this is information that is circulating in society and so on. So if people question this, we can say that this is denial. But people can still be skeptics, because I wasn't aware of Levi's work, but I have about the same argument, that because the opinion has been misled for so long, so people are uncertain. So they might be kind of like, they might have skeptical starting point, but they end up with denial, and people might deny even though they are skeptics, basically. And so when I think, for example, some analysis from Tuukka Ylantila from Finland has shown, for example, that right-wing populists usually, they are not denialist when it comes to science per se, but they are really kind of like categorizing true science, real science, and then less reliable science. And less reliable science is usually the social sciences and climate science. And the true science that we believe in is, for example, engineering and so on. So kind of like, let's see if I have like something else here. Well, kind of like if people have some existing beliefs, then they might perceive that those who are trying to change those beliefs have the burden of evidence. And then they might kind of like withhold changing the belief unless they get reliable evidence. And when it comes to reliability, they weigh in kind of all available sources of information. And here comes, for example, trust and who is saying what and so on. So sorry for a long question, but as I said, this is like a very interesting to me personally. So so kind of like going back to my proposal, could maybe say that we have to be able to say that some beliefs are irrational actually, but people who hold them are still rational because of
Well, I think we need to distinguish practical and theoretical, or epistemic and practical rationality here. One of Kahan's big points is that to be politically motivated reasoning is, he says, in some sense rational, because it's rational to try to stick in with your group. If you stick out, you have problems. And I think he's just conflating practical rationality with epistemic rationality. It may be practically rational to be epistemically irrational. That's possible. But it doesn't make you epistemically rational. Right? So I think, and that's a wild guess, that probably people are more rational, practically rational than epistemically rational. I don't know. That's possible. But in these cases, certainly there is epistemic irrationality. That's one thing. Then the other thing you raised, which I think is very interesting, is the suspension of belief. Right, because a lot of this skepticism is just like, well, I don't know. I mean, the scientists disagree, so I don't know if there's anthropogenic climate change. I was recently, I can't remember the exact numbers, but recently TV4 wanted to make like a TV show on the latest data on from some about Swedish poll on how people believe in climate change, whether in Sweden I can't remember the exact numbers, but they're like 10 whatever, some fairly low number of people who believe it's all false, right? And so then there was a discussion about them and so on. But I said to them, well, how about, there was another, I think 20% who didn't have a belief on the topic. And I'm like, how about that gang? How is that even possible? Right? To not have a belief. And so there's a discussion to be had also about suspension of belief when that's rational. Because, of course, that can be done rationally or irrationally. Early on in the pandemic, it was quite rational not to have any very firm beliefs about how the virus was spread and so on, right? Because there was a lot of expert disagreement. But in certain situations, and people were choosing the experts of their liking then, right? That was not so great. But in general, when to suspend belief when there's expert consensus, it's much harder to make that come out rational. When there's expert disagreement, absolutely, then suspension. And then, of course, there is the point, too, that a lot of people think there is a lot of expert disagreement on climate when there isn't, and that's where the propaganda comes in.
Yeah, like the denial machines, the goal of them is not to make people become denialists per se, but to spread doubt. And this is something that they have been able to do very well. Yeah.
That was the tobacco strategy, because they assumed, quite rightly, that if you're not sure whether smoking is dangerous, you will still smoke, because you kind of like it, right? So that was sufficient for that. And it might be sufficient for climate purposes too, because if people are not sure that climate change is real, I might as well fly to Thailand, might be okay. So in many cases, in some cases, I think suspension of belief is not quite sufficient. If you want to believe that the election was stolen, it's really quite important to believe that in order to storm the Capitolium, for example. You need to believe that, I think. So it depends.
Join me in thanking Åsa for this great talk and discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.
There are some talks coming up. March 12, Lena Wengerud, Why Women's Political Representation Affect Levels of Corruption, Trends in Bribery and Public Service Delivery Across European Regions. Quite long. title, she's a professor of political science at Gothenburg University. And then March 19, we have Patricia Mindus and Rebecca Stern from here, from our place. Judicial time and its role in immigration law are focused on Sweden, and they are both professors of law. I think, yes, they both are. No, one is a philosopher and one is a law. Sorry, I'm wrong on me. And then March 26, we have Christina Garsten, who is the principal of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, but also Professor social anthropology. And we don't know yet what she's going to talk about. I'm sure it's going to be great. So welcome then.